Dan Hamilton, Marine Corps veteran and host of the Next Gen Warrior Show. As always, the Next Gen Warrior Show is brought to you by Chairman George P. Bush and our dedicated staff at the Texas Veterans Land Board. Here at the Next Gen Warrior Show, we are proud to promote the success stories and the achievements in the military and veterans community. Today, joining me is Brett Godfrey. Among the many hats that Brett wears, he is an author, a lawyer, a pilot, a painter, and he is also an Air Force veteran. Brett, how are you today? It's great to have you on the program.
I'm doing just great, and thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. So I usually start out these conversations by asking our guests about their military service, but I want to go back to a younger version of you. I know that the time that you spent as a kid reading fiction, watching TV shows and movies had a big impact on, I think on not just your writing, but a really big impact on your life. And I was wondering if you could kind of take us back to those days, what you were reading, what you were maybe even writing at that point, and the movies that really inspired you to become an author.
Well, that's kind of a fun question. When I was about in fourth grade, I started reading books instead of comic books or, the funnies in the newspaper. The first adult book I ever read was Love Story by Eric Siegel. I used to read these. I like to watch Dark Shadows, which is a soap opera about vampires. It's probably the very first one. Now there's tons of them.
Yeah, now they're everywhere, huh?
Yeah, Barnabas Collins was my favorite TV show character. Of course, with the exception of Star Trek. But, nothing can beat Star Trek. But I used to read these pulp fiction novels that were based on the TV show Dark Shadows, and I loved them so much that I just got lost in them. And so one day I pulled out a spiral notebook and I decided to write my own Barnabas Collins story, and it went on for about 6 pages. And my parents were thinking, why, he can write 6 pages here, but he can't do 1 page of homework. So I think I fell in love with reading fiction, and writing it just seemed to be the flip side of the same coin.
Yeah. No, that's it's really interesting because those seminal moments in life are certainly what kind of, regardless of how young you might be, really kind of set the trajectory. I want to ask you though, because later in your life, you were, correct me if I'm wrong, but you were in law school. You had already gotten a degree, if I'm correct, in chemical engineering, and you decided at that point, that's when you wanted to join the military. Can you take us kind of through that thought process and what was happening in your life that made you want to join the service?
Well, sure. I've always loved airplanes. When I was a boy, I grew up with a trial lawyer father, and his military service had been in the Army in World War II. But he had a plane when I was a child, and my parents got divorced when I was about 10 years old, and he sold the plane before that. But he used to charter small planes all over Wyoming to go take depositions and attend trials. And after a while, I started getting invited to go as an observer on these trips. Invariably, I would be in the front seat, and my dad would sit in the back, and the charter pilot, would let me hold the stick.
That's awesome.
And this started at about age 10. And I got better and better at keeping the airplane straight and level, which is all I was asked to do. But I got to the point where I could hold my altitude within 100 feet, which is actually a difficult thing to do if you haven't done it before. And then I could hold a heading almost exactly, and I was real proud of that. And I knew that one day I wanted to learn how to land and take off. Those are the more sophisticated portions of the flight. But I had a fair number of hours just sitting in a cockpit of small planes. And I knew that one day I'd hoped I'd learn to fly. When I got accepted to law school, I drove down to Tulsa, and I had a friend who was a pilot, and I wanted a book on tape I could listen to on the long drive to Tulsa, which is about a 10-hour drive. And this friend gave me the ground school program on cassette tapes, and it was produced by Sporty's Pilot Shop. And I listened to that thing all the way down to Tulsa and finished it just when I got to Tulsa. It was kind of interesting. So the next day I got up, and I'd been in town less than a day, and I went over to the airport. It turns out there was a small airport, Riverside Airport, near my my apartment where I lived. And I went over there and I asked about what does it take to take the written examination, because I thought I could pass it. I'd really been paying attention to those tapes. So I took the written and I got 100% on it.
Wow.
And then, so I decided I'd start taking flying lessons. And I went to see the local flight doctor that people use to get their AME, which is aircraft medical exam. And I'd seen some A7s in the sky over Tulsa. And I asked the doc, I said, what are those jets that fly over all the time? He says, those are A7s from the Tulsa Air National Guard. And I said, do they have people go into the Guard and be a part-time pilot if they've not served in the active duty full-time Air Force? And he says, yeah, they have one slot a year. There's about 3,000 people that apply for it. But he then decides to tell me he's the flight surgeon for the 125th Tactical Fighter Squadron. And so I got my flight physical from the guy who gives flight physicals to the Guard. Next thing you know, I'm in what they call the pipeline, which means I'm taking the Air Force officer qualification test and hanging out at the base. And then pretty quickly I joined. So I did 6 years in the Oklahoma Air National Guard, and then 2 years of individual ready reserve. But I did drill weekends every weekend. You know, you're required to do it once a month. But if you're a pilot candidate, then you pretty much are out there every spare minute. So I did that and fell in love with the guys in that squadron. And in the last semester of law school, my pilot training slot came up. And there's a federal statute that says that you can't start pilot training if you're older than 26 and a half years when you first show up. So I was older than some of the people in my class in law school. And that's because it took me a long time to get through college. Engineering is a tough program. But I ended up having to drop out of law school in my last semester to go first to the McGee Tyson Air Force Base in Knoxville, Tennessee, which is where I got my commission, reserve commission in the Guard. And then about 6 weeks after I finished that program, I drove down to Lubbock Air Force Base, which used to be a pilot training facility, and that's how I got started. But by that time, I had about 3 years, just a little less than 3 years of experience in the Guard, and sort of felt like I knew a lot. The people that show up for pilot training have been trained in a program called Fishpot, which is where they go learn to fly the equivalent of a Cessna 172. I already had my pilot's license before I got to flight school because I put myself through a pilot license program while I was in law school. And so when I showed up, I had probably about 200 hours in the A7. And I'd, been around military flying, but not the kind of military flying that you do in pilot training. I've been doing real sorties, and I was flying formations and doing strafing runs and just similar air combat tactics where I was just getting started with that. And so I had a pretty good background there. And then when I got out, it turned out that the law school I'd been at had closed. Wow. And my plan was after this to go back to law school and get that last semester done. It turns out there's no law school there. This law school I'd been at was Oral Roberts, and the ABA shut that program down when Oral tried to give the law school to Pat Robertson when he was running for president.
Let me ask you this. In the midst of all of that, in the midst of law school, in the midst of, trying to make it through engineering school, going to pilot school, joining the Air Force, did the story of Black Sunrise, did it stay with you? Were you still working on the story through all of kind of the ups and downs of where your life has taken you?
The truth is, I don't really like to admit this to people, but I wrote the first draft of Black Sunrise when I was 19.
Did you really?
It was called Shock Flash, and it was 211 pages typed on a manual typewriter.
That
And
was
then,
going to be my other question. Is if do you ever handwrite, or did you mostly write on a typewriter?
well, I learned to type when I was young,
Okay.
and I could type much faster than I could write with a pen.
Right.
So I typed up the first manuscript, and my mom went through it with me and made editorial changes and scribbled all over everything. And then I retyped it, this time on an electric typewriter, which is a lot better. And then I made photocopies, and I send them out to agents and publishers whose names I got out of the myriad books that you can get if you're an aspiring writer. Got soundly rejected. And then I went to New York on a trip with my mother. And while I was there, I went to see a fellow named Bernard Shercliffe, who was the head of Warner Communications print division. And I just showed up in his office in a skyscraper in New York with this 2-inch thick manuscript. And the lady in the front this slayed her. She thought this was hysterical. Nobody gets an audience with Bernard Shercliffe. I mean, unless you're.
You were ready to kick in the door and try to get to work, huh?
Yeah. So I said, she says, he will not read this. I said, well, will you? And then vouch for me. And she says, if I like the book, I will. And this is just the lady at the front. And by that time, I had struck up a friendship with a guy named Mark Olden, who was a pretty famous writer. And I sent him some fan mail, and he answered it, and I wrote back, and he wrote back, and we traded lots and lots of letters. And in fact, I have one character of his in Black Sunrise, and that was with his permission. He died in 1995. But I changed the name of the book from Shock Flash to Black Sunrise, rewrote it when I was 22, and then kept rewriting it and rewriting it and rewriting it until I was thinking it's a pretty good book. It's ready to go.
A question I have for you, two questions. One, do you still have the original paper manuscript?
Yeah, it's on the shelf behind me here.
That's awesome. And two, what I admire in so many of our guests that we have on this program is what I guess it would boil down to emotional intelligence. And one of the things that I have seen borne out in a lot of the personal and professional growth stories of our guests is longevity. And I can certainly identify, those marks when you go back to, like an 8-year-old coming up with the idea to write, or where the inspiration is, then out to 22 when you're starting to rewrite it, or 19 when you wrote the book. But there is an element of longevity where you did not take your eye off the ball of wanting to write this book. Were there any times during those decades that you said, I'm done with this, I want to hang it up? Or were you always pretty intent on finishing the book?
Well, I did finish the first and the second and the third drafts. I wanted to be like Mark Olden. And there was another time I had set it aside and stopped the project for probably 2 years in engineering school, the last 2 years, because it was getting really tough. Chemical engineering is a really tough program. So I couldn't put the time into working on the book anymore. But I was laying in bed reading 2010 by Arthur C. Clarke. And it was a good book. I really liked it a lot. I like science fiction, but I like thrillers more. And at the end of it, he had an afterword, or an author's note. And he said that he had written the entire thing on a compact portable computer from his home in Sri Lanka. And I wanted a computer so bad I could taste it. And it was, but I didn't have the money to buy one until, it was after that I started saving up to buy a computer. And I bought a Sanyo floppy drive computer.
Yeah.
But I thought, wow, to sit down at a computer, write a book, and become famous is so alluring. The piece I was missing was being a good writer. Other than that, I had all the ingredients. And
I had the dream and the desire, right?
Yeah, I had 10 fingers and knew how to spell. So at least I thought I did. And I just renewed my desire to do that. And then I finished a version that's very close to what's on the market now. And then I let that sit for 4 years, and then I pulled it off and rewrote it again.
Hmm.
And
Can I ask you a question too about some of the character development? My mom is a writer, and I really love to write. Um, I don't have the longevity that you have to be able to complete the storyline, to do the character development, to change the plot. I do kind of more like journaling, right? Like every day a different idea or a goal or something like that. I love the process of writing, but I have found through writing that sometimes the things that I would want to write down, whether it be in a journal or just kind of in my daily tracker, come to me at kind of random times. It could be right before you get to sleep, something like that, where you get hit with the new idea of, oh, I should write this down, because if you don't, you wake up in the morning and you've kind of lost that thought, or you've lost that moment of inspiration. Has that happened to you during the writing process, or there's certain times?
yes,
Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
absolutely. It's a serious problem. It's not anymore a serious problem because I have one of these.
Oh, yes. Yes, you
Okay.
got the Apple Watch. You can talk right into it, right?
I'll just push the button and say, hey, you know who? Because I got 3 iPads laying here, and she'll start talking if I say her name. But,
They all try to get in on the conversation, huh?
yeah, so I'll dictate a reminder into my watch, and it might be something like, remember to dress up the hunting knife,
Hmm.
which is just a plot cue for me in Black Sunrise. These days, so I finished Black Sunrise after what was literally 40 years of effort. And so people think, well, if he's going to write a sequel, he'll be 120 when he gets out.
Doing the math, huh?
But so I started writing the book Convergence of Demons about a month after Black Sunrise went public. And I'm almost done with that book. And literally it's writing itself. And I've had chapters that I was a reader, not a writer, that I'm just staring at the computer screen, watching this chapter unfold in front of me. And it's just happening. It's almost like I'm just a passive observer. And I did this very elaborate outline for the book because CJ Box told me that, it makes you a better writer. And he's a guy from Cheyenne, Wyoming. He lives in Cheyenne now. And I'm a Wyoming boy myself. But the outline just got trashed because as soon as I started writing and putting more detail into the actual development of the characters and the dialogue and all of those fundamentals that you have to have in place, the story just took over. It literally ripped the book out of my hands and wrote itself.
That has to be a pretty tremendous feeling, right? I mean, that's like kind of I guess in sports, you would call that being in the zone, right? Where you are locked in.
Yes, and it is bliss. Where it's not bliss is when you come back the next day and edit. Because I always, when I finish a chapter, I always wait a day, go back, do an editorial pass through that chapter, and then write another chapter. And I'm averaging a chapter a day. I put about, these days, because I've got so much time on my hands with the pandemic, I have time to write. So I get a chapter a day pretty much on average.
Yeah, so that was what I actually wanted to ask you when we did the intro to the show. I talked about the many different hats you wear. You talked about being in the Air Force and the reserves. You talked about being a pilot as well as being a lawyer. When you write and when you're in that kind of zone, does it require focusing on that one thing, even though you have a passion for many different areas in your life?
It varies. Sometimes it's like just pouring out of me. But there's other times where I'll write a chapter that I might spend 20 hours doing research to write a chapter. So for example, in the Convergence of Demons sequel to Black Sunrise, I have a scene that involves a small submersible vehicle. And so I thought, is there such a thing as a mega yacht that would have its own mini sub? Turns out the answer is yes, and they're made by a company called Triton. So I had to learn the technical details of the Triton 3300 5/6 5-passenger submersible vehicle that will go down to 3,000 feet or more. Um, and I needed to describe what it was like to open the hatch and climb in, start the thing up and run it in a way that isn't laborious or odious levels of technical detail that have kind of plagued some writers after Tom Clancy, because he did that and he did it well, but a lot of authors just give you pages of technical drivel. It's just detail. It doesn't, it's not interesting, and it doesn't help the story.
Doesn't push the story along.
Yeah. So I get the technical side down. Sometimes I'll just write out all the technical stuff about the mini sub, and then, or a certain kind of gun or a certain kind of computer. There's a supercomputer that is in both of my books, and they call it the Beast. It runs on the Oak Ridge National Laboratory supercomputer with software that this elite group of private military contractors and private intelligence contractors have written the software to run on Oak Ridge. And then Oak Ridge leases out the use of that software, but then gives free computer time to the Brecht Group, which is the name of this outfit. So a lot of research. Sometimes it'll take, I've had paragraphs that took me 3 days to write.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, do you find the research part, is it interesting for you? Is it easy for you? Or is it just kind of part of the job and you just got to go ahead and do it and get it over with?
It's actually more of the former. I really like doing research. It's part of my job as a lawyer. I do an awful lot of research. If I represent a company that makes a medical device, I have to know every single thing there is to know about that medical device, including its history, its regulatory approval, everything. So it's something I do anyway. But for example, the theme of my second book is the Russian mafia.
Yeah.
And the head of the Russian mob these days is a man named Simeon Migolovich. And I read every single thing I could get my hands on about him. And then I made up a fake version of him and gave him more personality and, a very romantic mobster boss lifestyle, which includes a mega yacht. And so there's that.
I was going to ask you how much more I can pull out of you on Convergence of Demons. I don't know how much you're allowed to let slip right now, but what can people look forward to in hearing from the story?
I have to tread lightly here because even small details about Convergence of Demons, it would be a spoiler for Black Sunrise. The Kirkus review for Black Sunrise says there's more than one unexpected death. But then it says, nevertheless, at the end, he's got this teed up for a good sequel. But you don't know who died. Some people died you didn't think were going to die. But who they are, if I tell you much about Convergence of Demons, I'll tell you who lived through Black Sunrise. But the general gist of it is this elite investigative outfit, the Brecht Group, was started by a man named Albert Brecht, who had been in the OSS and later in the CIA. And he started a private company. And there's lots of companies out there that do these kinds of things. And I read as much as I could about as many of those companies as I could when I designed the Brecht Group. But that said, it turns out that earlier in Albert's life, he made a serious enemy of a KGB colonel by feeding him misinformation. And that KGB colonel went on to become the president of the Russian Federation. His name is Vladimir Putin. But Putin is, in real life, Putin is good buds with this Simeon Migolovich guy.
Yeah.
He's a real person. My version of him, the head of all the Bratvas, which is the Brotherhood. My Bratva has a slightly different name. The Bratva that Simeon Migolovich runs is called the Russian Mafia. So it's the Russiskoye Bratva. And so mine is called the Brotherhood of Bloodshed.
Wow.
Bratva. And so then I got to get a bunch of Russian words in my head, So
you gotta work on studying some Russian. Do in these stories, is there somebody that you either bounce the ideas off of, or do you keep it all to yourself?
Well, you can't see her. She's off the camera angle, but I got married recently, just only 32 years ago. And she reads every chapter as it comes off the press. We have a kind of a ritual where at the end of the day, we'll sit down sometimes with a shot of scotch, and
There you go.
she'll read whatever I've done since the last time. And it's almost a daily ritual now, but she'll catch things that don't make sense or that come off as campy. One thing new writers have a disease, and it's to be campy. I'm reading a book right now called The Prodigal Son by Greg Hurwitz. And it's about a similar kind of storyline. He's got a professional assassin who was raised and pulled out of an orphanage and raised as a hitman. But and these books are exceptional. I can't tell you how much of a fan I am of Greg Hurwitz, but he puts humor in his books, and he does it in such a masterful way that it doesn't crap up the story. But a lot of writers can't resist putting in inside jokes, between themselves and themselves. And it looks like a sort of a smug, self-satisfied, hey, I'm a writer now, so I can get away with anything. And that destroys the quality of good prose. So you got to be very careful with your attempts at humor, but you need your characters to have enough personality that the audience wants to know more about. And if you don't get that, you're dead in the water. Nobody's going to read the book.
So, if you don't mind here, I'm going to switch gears just a little bit to some of your painting, and I was really blown away by your artwork, and it must take a very different, or maybe it doesn't. It must take a very different mindset or a very different approach, but it's still the same creative outlet for you, is it, or is it kind of a different process?
It's 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 exactly the same. I mean, my favorite recreational days are days I'll spend the first half of the day painting and the second half of the day writing. And it's really fun to transition because they really both use the same part of my brain. And I'm a trial lawyer, so most of what I do is courtroom work on cases that tend to be large disputes, like 10 million plus kind of a civil action. And when I go into court, I've got over 100 trials, and I don't use notes when I'm giving a closing argument or an opening statement. And I can tell you my last trial, I've won my last 9 trials in a row, but I've had some losses too. I don't want to mislead you, but
Are you able to just do it off the top of your head? Or are you almost able to just memorize the material?
no, let me tell you what happened. My last trial was the best closing argument I've ever given in my life. And I was the defendant. I mean, I was representing the defendant. So I'm sitting here listening to the plaintiff's lawyer give the closing for the plaintiff. And it's very thorough and very workmanlike and very mechanical. And she's a competent lawyer. She's a veteran, trial lawyer, as opposed to a military vet. And I'm sitting there freaking out because I have no idea what I'm going to say in my closing. None. I had no clue.
Flying by the seat of your pants?
Well, I was starting to freak out. And I've had this a lot over my career. But, the woman sits down and the federal judge says, Mr. Godfrey, defense closing. So I get up and I pour myself some water. It's a stall tactic that lawyers use in courtrooms. They pour water to stall or to let a pregnant silence hang theatrically. So I got up and I set the water glass back down on my table. And instead of staying at the podium, which she'd done, I go over and stood right in front of the jury rail. And I had no idea what I was going to say, but I looked at the carpet and I said, give. So I had a word that came out. It's like, well, that's cool. A man, a fish, and you will feed him for a day. Teach a man to fish, and you'll feed him for a lifetime. And it just like with the books, it just came pouring out. And when I was done, I thought, this is just about the best thing I've ever done in my career ever. And I was really, really happy. So I sat down, and she gets to do one last closing. It's called a rebuttal closing. And the judge says, Ms. DeLolio, and she stood up and she's flipping her legal pad back and forth. And she goes, wow, I just wasn't ready for that. And she sits down. That's her rebuttal closing.
Wow.
And she couldn't function at that point. This is what you call a kill in a courtroom. This is an outright kill. And of course, we won the case. But it's kind of an interesting thing. It just came out of me. I was listening to it as the jury was listening to it.
It's the same way with the writing, huh? Is that a function then of processing information and kind of holding on to it until the moment that you really need it? Are you subconsciously kind of chewing on your surroundings or what you're hearing or the information that you've been taking in over weeks, if months, if not years?
When I do my best work, that is true.
Okay.
A lot of cases, I'll be piecing together the closing during the entire trial, or I'll start making notes of something I need to go back and explain. And in this last trial, I had all kinds of notes I'd written out for the closing, never looked at them, didn't touch them. When I got up, I mean, she's got paper all over the podium. I got up, I had one hand in my pocket and the other one, it's a habit stance that I have. I just stand like that.
Yeah.
And I walked right up to the jury rail and just started going. And none of the stuff I put in my notes was used. So it was an extemporaneous delivery,
Right.
that I can't prepare a closing that good. I just don't know how. I can give it, I can't prepare it.
Let me ask you this: for a veteran who is out there, or maybe somebody who is in the service and they're thinking about writing, and maybe they have something that they put down on paper, or maybe they have, like you suggested earlier, somewhat of an outline. What are a couple pieces of advice that you would give that maybe somebody who's on active duty or a veteran who's going, okay, what do I do with this information, and what do I do with this story that's in my head?
Well, the prevailing wisdom on that question is to do an outline first. Do character sketches where you write out the basic character personality traits and little weird idiosyncrasies that characters have, and develop who the characters are in your mind, and then draw up this super detailed outline. I find that if you've done the character creation well enough and thorough enough that you know how that character talks, you know how that character thinks, you know how they react to things, because you've really built a very three-dimensional full person in your mind, and you've made several of these. If you do that, the dialogue writes itself, because the part of your brain that can simulate Mark Jensen, or the part of your brain that can simulate Albert Brecht or Arthur Beeman, these are characters from Black Sunrise, that the brain knows what they would do, and you just let them do it. And of course, that's subject to heavy editing by me and others, but that's the flow. So my advice would be, think about your story, think about what the characters are like, and then either make an outline or just start writing. I went to a speech once that was given by Stephen Hunter, who wrote the books about Bob Lee Swagger. His first one was called Point of Impact, and the Mark Wahlberg's The Shooter. That was based on that book by Stephen Hunter. And he said he doesn't outline, he just writes. He'll write so much, 2 pages or something like that, but he does it every single day. And he said, let me tell you the number one reason that people don't get their books published. This outweighs all the others put together. They didn't finish it. He says, first, finish the book. Until it's finished, it has zero chance of publication. And this runs against the old wisdom, which was, write 5 chapters and put a query submission packet together and send it to an agent. And if they like it, they'll tell you, and you contract and finish the book. That's not how it works in the real world in this day and age. People finish the book and they have it ready to go before they make contact with a potential agent or a publisher. A lot of people self-publish. I self-published Black Sunrise. And given how it's selling, I can't believe it. It's just like, holy crap. So I got the best guy there is to do the audiobook. His name is George Weedall. He does Daniel Silva, Greg Hurwitz, Vince Flynn. He did a bunch of Clancy's. The list goes on and on. But I called him up and said, will you do my book? And he says, nobody, you're not a known guy. And I said, no, this is the first book. So he says, well, send me 5 chapters, and if I like it, I'll get back to you. So he called me back 5 days later. He'd read the entire book.
Wow.
And he was going, wow. And literally he said these words to me. He says, you are right up there with Daniel, because awesome. Daniel's his favorite guy. And I don't think that's a true statement. I think Silva's
feels better. Pretty good to hear though, huh?
Yeah, from a guy like that. And he says, of course I'll do your book. And that audiobook is selling like crazy right now. So my advice is take it a step at a time. Here's one more piece.
Yeah.
Don't censor yourself. People come up with ideas and immediately judge the idea. That's a bad thing for a creative professional. You come up with the idea and you get it out and do something with it. And don't judge it until later. So I don't start editing or censoring myself. I just have faith and I write. But some guys would write a first sentence of a book and get frustrated and scribble it out, and write another sentence and get frustrated and scribble it out. That's that self-censorship. You're trying to judge your work as you're doing your work. And that's bad for a fiction writer.
I'm glad you brought that up. And for our audience, you can find Black Sunrise on Amazon Books, Audible, Google Books, and you can keep up with Brett at brettgodfrey.com. And we're certainly looking forward to Convergence of Demons. And before we let you go, I wanted to see if there was anything else maybe that we didn't hit on today that you would like to leave our audience with.
Well, I know there's a lot of veterans out there that it's very popular now for writers to play on their military background. The best example of that would be Jack Carr, former head of SEAL Team 3. And, his character is a former Navy SEAL. So take advantage of your military background. The head character in my book is a trial lawyer and a former F-16 pilot. And, that was easy for me to write. So take advantage of your military background. Take advantage of all your unique special life experiences, even the ones that are embarrassing.
No, I think it's great wisdom, Brett. And I appreciate you being with us and really walking us through some really exciting times in your life, and also giving us a little bit of a tease on Convergence of Demons. Best of luck with the upcoming book, and thank you again so much for being with us.
Well, again, thank you for having me.
Absolutely. On behalf of Chairman George P. Bush and our staff at the Texas Veterans Land Board, thank you so much for tuning in to another episode of Next Gen Warrior. We'll see you back here next Monday.
Follow us on Instagram at Voices of Vets, on Twitter at Voice of Veterans, and on Facebook at facebook.com/Voices of Veterans. To hear more, please visit voicesofveterans.org. Join us in sharing the success stories of Texas veterans. Thank you for joining us for the Next Gen Warrior podcast.